Dear listener, greetings and a warm welcome. Thank you for tuning into Life Learnings. We're delighted to have your company. Life Learnings is a program that shares information with people. It can be people's experiences, their life journey, but also their expertise in specific areas. Now, I have a very interesting guest with me in the studio today, and her name is Lea-Anne Smith. Lea-Anne, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
It's lovely to have you. Now, you have a very unique occupation. Perhaps you can tell us, before we start about the occupation, just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you live and work.
Well, I live in Toowoomba in sunny Queensland.
Oh, that's a beautiful place. Yeah.
And I have a wonderful husband and a beautiful 12-year-old daughter.
Okay, so you're a mum and a wife.
I'm a mum and a wife, and I run a couple of small businesses as well.
Okay, well, you sound like you'll be very busy. So tell us a little bit about your occupation. What do you do?
Well, I'm a breathing retrainer and an orofacial myologist.
Okay, well, you'll have to explain both of those. Let's start with the breathing retrainer. What is a breathing retrainer?
Well, a breathing retrainer looks at people's breathing habits and how they interact with health. There's research that shows us that breathing habits impact a number of health conditions quite markedly.
Okay.
And improving breathing habits can change health and improve it. So we look at things like asthma, snoring, sleep apnea, panic disorder, hay fever. These are all conditions. Even crowded teeth in children can be a result of poor breathing. I know.
Is that right?
People give me the strangest looks, but it all makes sense. And before we threw
so
the
this
day,
is scientific. This is not just...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So breathing retrainers work naturally on those conditions to supplement what people might be doing medically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have a fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward to learning a lot about the importance of breathing because, obviously, breathing is probably the most important thing. You can die within a matter of minutes if you don't breathe.
Absolutely.
Second to that would be water, and I guess the third to that would be food. But breathing is one of the most important things we do for life and vitality. So I can understand that this is a very important aspect of our being, and if we do that wrong, that would make sense. That would have some sort of a health impact on us.
Yeah, as they say, oxygen is king.
Oxygen is king. Okay, fantastic. Now, the other part of it you mentioned, which is one that's actually even a little bit more intriguing, is it the orofacial myologist?
Yeah, orofacial myology.
Now, what does that entail?
Well, it's about the muscle use of the face and the lips and the tongue. And particularly children can develop patterns of muscle use that are not good for their health, and they can also develop orofacial habits. So it could be as simple as biting fingernails or sucking dummies and bottles and not being able to give these things up, sucking fingers and thumbs.
Okay.
And all of these things impact the development of the face. Also mouth breathing, and of course that is a breathing habit, and this is why I work with orofacial myology. As well as being a breathing retrainer.
Okay, so one complements the other?
Absolutely. Okay. So I use orofacial myology with children who have a mouth breathing habit which is adversely impacting their health.
Okay, so I was just going to ask you, so mouth breathing is good or bad, but it sounds like that's something we want to avoid. You want to breathe through the nose?
Absolutely. You know, God gave us a nose for a very good reason.
Otherwise, what purpose would it serve other than holding up your glasses? Okay. Oh, that's fascinating. So I wonder if we can maybe just step back because, how you got into this field, it would be a fascinating story. So can we just step back a little bit and you can tell us how you ended up where you are at the moment?
Yeah, sure. This story is very much born out of my own personal experience.
Okay.
I grew up with lots of colds and flus and always sick as a child. Suffered with airborne allergies quite severely.
Right.
Developed a chronic cough in my late teens, early 20s that really started to dominate my life. Ended up starting to miss a lot of work just because my coughing was so far out of control. It was finally diagnosed as an asthmatic cough, probably in my early 30s.
Oh, really?
And at that stage I was put on a medication, but the asthma continued to get worse. They added more medication, and then we ended up doing the hospital runs because, my breathing was so bad and I was struggling to breathe. So my asthma was really getting out of control, and I ended up on a lot of medication for my asthma. But around that time, probably, my late 30s, my husband and I hadn't had a child, so we went on to the IVF program. And it was while I was on the IVF program, my asthma was still playing up. And eventually my doctors said to me, look, Lea-Anne, your asthma is not well enough controlled to be on the IVF program.
Yeah.
You need to get off of some of this medication before we can really put you back on it. So then I knew that I had to find a non-pharmaceutical solution for my asthma. And at the time I was a registered nurse, and I did a lot of research into things that might be able to be done to help my asthma and my chronic cough so that I could get back to this program and have a child.
Okay. So you've got a nursing background as well.
Yes, I do.
So that's complementary to where you find yourself at the moment, no doubt.
Yeah, well, and how that played in was that when I found this breathing technique called Buteyko breathing, and I researched it, I recognised instantly why it might work, because I was a registered nurse. I was well versed in looking after ventilated patients in intensive care.
Okay.
I understood blood gases and the role of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body. And when I read about the Buteyko technique, I thought, this has to work. And so I actually found a trainer, and she accepted me into a program. And she was already booked out, but I think this coughing, wheezing person on the other end of the phone, she felt sorry for me and put me into the program. And within 3 or 4 days, I was off half my medication and feeling better than I'd felt in months and months. And several months more, I was off all my medication. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's remarkable. So you, by experience, received the benefits from these breathing techniques?
Absolutely.
And learning how to breathe properly?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm curious, why would people end up breathing incorrectly? I mean, how do we form those habits?
Well, that's a really good question, because every baby's born breathing through its nose.
Okay.
And every baby is born breathing very gently. In fact, we tiptoe into their rooms to check that they are actually still breathing.
Right.
We look at them very carefully. But you take that same person, 60 years later, and sometimes at night, there is no doubt they're breathing. You can hear them, you can hear the snoring
like
three blocks away. So breathing does change over a lifetime.
Yeah.
And it's like other bodily systems, I guess. You take things like weight control or our eyesight, our hearing. Things can deteriorate over a lifetime as a result of often lifestyle influences. And breathing is no different. So the things that change our breathing, often a lot of stress can change our breathing, grief and loss. Sometimes it's as simple as getting a blocked nose. Okay.
Yes.
So for children, this is often the case. Their diets are much more inflammatory, and so noses block, and then a child switches to mouth breathing, and it just unleashes a cascade of happenings in the body. So there's some of the things that change our breathing. We're not as physically active as we used to be. There are dietary things that interact with our breathing as well. So there's a whole cascade of things that can happen.
It's interesting. I was just talking to someone over the weekend who has had a lot of stress they had to deal with, actually burnt out. And they just had a problem. They couldn't breathe. They struggled to breathe. There was something wrong. And then they thought maybe they had asthma. They tested that. And then they did like a lung capacity test, and they finally figured out it was just stress. They were just overtaxed.
Yeah, that's exactly the sort of person that I work with.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So breathing can be a big part of the recovery, but they may be in that situation not only because of the stress, but because how they breathe.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So you mentioned this interesting name, the technique. Is it Buteyko? Maybe you'll have to say it, sorry.
Buteyko.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is Buteyko?
Well, Buteyko, it's a name. It comes from the name Professor Konstantin Buteyko.
Okay.
And it's a Russian name.
Right.
He was a man who was born in the 1920s. He had a great interest in all things moving, machinery, and worked on a farm. He went off to war and felt incredibly helpless as a medic, and came back and decided he would study medicine, study the greatest machine, his interest in how things work. And so he studied the human body, and he developed a real interest in his training in breathing. In fact, apparently he would wander the wards at night and sit next to people and watch them breathe. And one of the things he noticed was that people who are unwell breathe differently to people who are well. And he wondered whether changing how a person breathes when their health is not optimal would change their health. And so he set up a huge laboratory. This was actually in the days of the Cold War, the space wars between Russia and the US. So he was able to get a lot of funding to research breathing. And he had a huge laboratory where he looked at people's breathing and tested parameters and did research. And he did indeed find that if you changed how a person breathed, you could impact their health positively if they were breathing in an unhealthy way.
Right, okay. So you say breathing in an unhealthy way. Can we underbreathe or can we overbreathe?
You know, you can do either.
Okay.
You can do either. But the vast majority, 99% of people I see are actually overbreathing.
Overbreathing?
Overbreathing, yeah. Now, most of us, it can be a real struggle to get a head around this because, you know, we do understand that oxygen's important, and we often think that if we breathe more, we'll get more oxygen.
Yeah, more of a good thing.
Yeah,
okay, but that more of a good thing is not always good.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you can overdrink. You can drink too much water.
Yeah, that's true.
You can sleep too much. And you can eat too much.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, and you can actually breathe too much. And when you do that, it upsets certain gases in your system, the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels particularly. So, breathing properly is very important. So your question, yes, over-breathing is much more of a problem than under-breathing.
Right, okay, because I was actually thinking initially when I thought, okay, well, obviously that person's just not breathing enough or they're breathing too shallow, not having, obviously, the medical background that you have and understanding of it. So the over-breathing, so what does over-breathing do to the human body?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, in the atmosphere, we basically have three gases. We have nitrogen,
right,
which is about 78%, something like that.
Okay.
78%, and it's what we call an inert gas. So when you breathe it in, it doesn't really interact with the body, not unless you go deep sea diving, and then of course, you know, it does interact with the body, and you can end up with the bends. But at normal atmospheric pressures, nitrogen does not interact with the body. Oxygen is about 21% of the atmosphere. And when we breathe in, the air that we breathe in is about 21% oxygen. When we breathe out, it's about 18%. So we only take in a small part of the oxygen in the air, which is really important. You know, this to me is evidence of a creator, because he's created a huge reserve in the amount of oxygen that's actually in the atmosphere. And we can call on that when we need to exert ourselves heavily, or if there's a depletion of oxygen in the atmosphere. So we only take on a small amount of that oxygen.
So about 3% of it disappears out of the total gas that you take in?
Of the 21%.
From the 21%, it drops down to 18.
Yes, yeah. And this is exactly why CPR works.
I was just going to say, because I always wondered if someone has just used up all that oxygen and they're breathing into someone else's lungs, there's no oxygen left. But you're saying there's still 18% of the gas going into the other person is still oxygen.
Yes.
And they can still extract oxygen from it then.
That's exactly right. So breathing harder doesn't always necessarily give us more oxygen, because there's plenty of oxygen in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And our body's good at extracting what we need.
Right.
So unless we increase our exertion, we don't really need to increase our breathing. The other gas that is very important to us, of course, is carbon dioxide.
Okay.
And it exists at 0.03% in the atmosphere, which is very, very, very tiny.
Yes, it is.
Not much at all. In the human lung, however, it's much higher. So when we breathe in, it's 0.03%. When we breathe out, it can be anywhere from 3% to 6%.
Okay, so there's a significant, it's like 100-fold plus increase in...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the difference between 0.03% and 6% is actually 200.
200%, yeah.
200%. So that means if you start breathing a little harder than you need to, you can very quickly alter the amount of carbon dioxide that's in your bloodstream.
Okay.
And that has ramifications for the human body. So we know that gases move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. That's just how it works. And so if you drop that level of carbon dioxide in your body, certain things can happen that adversely affect your health.
So is there an optimal balance of how much you've got to have in your body? And if you mess with that balance, like with wrong breathing, what are the effects, basically? Okay. So maybe the first question first, and then we get to the effects of it. Yeah.
So the optimal levels in the body, generally it's accepted to be about 3.5% to 6% in the human lung.
Okay.
I measure it in millimetres of mercury. It's a bit like your blood pressure, is measured in millimetres of mercury. Carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your lung can be measured as well in millimetres of mercury. And I look for levels when I do my testing of between 35 and 50.
Okay.
So many people actually have much lower levels than that, and that's when it starts to cause symptoms.
Right, okay. So can we maybe start talking about some of these symptoms? Because there might be people out there listening at the moment, and they might be saying, listen, I think I've got some of those symptoms. Maybe my breathing is not what it should be.
Okay, well, let's talk about what carbon dioxide does in the human body. And look, let me say, most people think it's just a poison you've got to get rid of. There's nothing that's further than the truth. Keeping your carbon dioxide levels within certain parameters is something your body automatically does unless we get unwell and our body systems get a bit messed with. But one of the things it does, carbon dioxide in the body, is it actually dilates our bronchi, so our airways. So our airways actually expand up when we have enough carbon dioxide.
Okay.
So, and it happens for this reason, that our airways is aligned with smooth muscle, and smooth muscle relaxes whenever carbon dioxide levels are in the normal range or higher. And so if your carbon dioxide level is low, if you've been breathing harder than you need to for what your body needs at any point in time, your carbon dioxide level becomes low, and then what happens is the smooth muscle in your airways constricts.
Okay.
And
so
this is
impacts the
primarily
lung capacity then, does it?
Yeah. This is primarily what causes asthma, is that these airways constrict down, and then you find it hard to get air in and out, particularly out.
Well, that's a significant impact, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, the research studies show this, that asthmatics typically and chronically have low levels of carbon dioxide in their expired breath.
So if I was a lay person, I had no idea about this breathing, and I've got asthma, I'm thinking, well, I need to breathe and really focus on my breathing and breathe a lot. But what I'm actually doing is I'm actually not helping myself. In effect, I could be hindering myself because I'm reducing the CO2 levels in my bloodstream, which then has the restrictive effect on the smooth muscles, and therefore the lung capacity is reduced, and that's exactly the opposite of what I need.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and we'll talk more about some of the other effects that happen with asthma as well. We'll get a complete picture of it.
Okay, good.
So the other thing that it does, because carbon dioxide relaxes smooth muscle, all our arteries are made out of smooth muscle. They're lined with smooth muscle. And so this was actually how good old Professor Buteyko discovered some of this. He discovered that in people with high blood pressure, that often their carbon dioxide levels were lower, and so their vessels were constricting. And when you raise the carbon dioxide level, when people returned to normal breathing and weren't over-breathing anymore, then those arteries would relax and open up. So, and that's related to the fact that carbon dioxide relaxes smooth muscle. So it opens the airways, it opens the blood vessels. And there's other smooth muscle in the body as well. Our GIT system is made out of smooth muscle. And so low carbon dioxide level can affect the GIT system in some people, and they end up with reflux, which is, the stomach acids, the pepsin in the stomach rising up into the esophagus and sometimes even the airways.
So GRT, just to break that down, is the G stands for the
gastrointestinal tract.
Gastrointestinal tract, okay.
Yeah, so our stomach and intestines, yeah.
Wow. Well, there's a few we've mentioned so far. Have we exhausted the list, or is there more things that are impacted?
There are more things. You know, the bladder is also made out of smooth muscle.
Oh.
And so as we get older, many people have to get up in the night to go to the toilet. And we often find with breathing retraining that once we help people normalise their nighttime breathing, that they don't need to get up as often in the night because their bladder is more relaxed because it's smooth muscle.
Yeah.
And also there's some other mechanisms that can happen that switch on urine making at night that can happen if we're not sleeping properly. And if we're not breathing properly, that's one of the big disturbers of good sleep.
And then when you're particularly tired and you wake up in the middle of the night, you go, well, look, I can't wait anymore. I've got to go to the loo. That can disrupt your sleep quite a bit.
Absolutely.
And if it happens more than once a night, that's not a good thing. I can understand. And then next morning you wake up and, sleeping is so important to our well-being and, our cognitive ability.
Absolutely.
I can see how the breathing, one thing affects another, and before you know, there's a whole lot of other things that actually affect your overall well-being.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So that's some of the things that carbon dioxide does. Another thing that carbon dioxide does in the human body is it blocks histamine release. Now, histamine, you've probably heard of an antihistamine. What do you do if you've got allergies?
Okay, you take an antihistamine.
You take an antihistamine. Yeah.
Okay.
But carbon dioxide is actually a natural antihistamine. So what happens if your carbon dioxide levels are low, if you're over-breathing, maybe you're mouth breathing and that's causing you to over-breathe, then your histamine, your carbon dioxide levels are low and this causes histamine to be released in the body, and so you have much stronger allergy responses than you might otherwise have.
So what kind of allergies? Could this be more than just pollen? I mean, some people get the...
Firstly, your airborne allergies.
Okay, yeah. But there could be other, even non-airborne...
Yeah.
So even food allergies potentially?
Potentially, but mainly your airborne allergies.
Right, understand. Yeah. All right.
So something else that carbon dioxide does is it calms the nervous system. We have two nervous systems in our body. We have what we call the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I liken this to a car with an accelerator and a brake. So the sympathetic nervous system is like putting your foot on the accelerator.
So that is the sympathetic one, foot on the accelerator?
Yeah. So it's the one that revs up our heart rate, revs up our breathing rate. It gets us ready for the fight or the flight, basically.
Okay.
Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is what puts the brakes on all of that. It slows us down, it prepares us for sleep, and helps us feel calm.
Okay, so you need both.
We need both. We need a balance between both. And we all know people who've had an imbalance one way or the other.
Either hyperactive or not active enough.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so what carbon dioxide does is it stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. It actually makes us feel calmer.
Okay.
And so kids with low carbon dioxide, they're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. People with panic disorder and anxiety sometimes are suffering with low carbon dioxide syndrome. So that is something that can respond to better breathing. It also balances our body pH, our blood pH. That's a really complicated one, so the medical people are interested in that, but I won't bore our listeners with that one today.
The pH is important because, I know that a lot of people who have a pH imbalance, for example, can even have effects of osteoporosis and even brittle bones.
Exactly, yes.
So breathing can even have an impact on that.
Absolutely. And for the simple reason, I'll just explain a tiny little bit of it.
Okay.
When you dissolve carbon dioxide in water, you get a substance called H2CO3, which is hydrogen carbonic acid.
Okay.
Hydrocarbonic acid.
Yeah, because the more oxygen you have in there, the more acidic it becomes. I think someone's explained to me.
The more carbon dioxide.
More carbon dioxide.
The more carbon dioxide.
The more CO you have in there.
The more CO2 that you have in the water, it becomes it's an acid, and so your body regulates your pH second by second through your breathing rate. And so if your little chemoreceptors that govern your breathing rate have been not working as well as they should, then it changes our body pH.
Wow. So we take just breathing for granted, and we just think, well, how simple is that? But there's actually a lot of factors that can be affected by overbreathing, because this is what we're primarily talking about at the moment, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the other thing you mentioned, obviously after the pH, you were talking about breathing or sleep apnea.
So sometimes, particularly central sleep apnea, is sometimes caused by low carbon dioxide at night, because it's the breathing driver. It's the thing that actually keeps us breathing. Most people think that if you hold your breath for 15, 20, 30 seconds and you feel a really strong desire to breathe, they think that it's the oxygen dropping in your bloodstream that makes you want to breathe.
Okay.
It's not. It's actually the rising carbon dioxide levels. Once again, another evidence of a creator. Because it means that you have a greater reserve in your blood supply of oxygen that you can still call on, even if for some reason you can't breathe for a minute. Okay. So your carbon dioxide keeps you breathing, particularly at night. The other mechanisms that keep us breathing tend to be switched off, and so at night it's purely the carbon dioxide level in your blood that keeps you breathing.
Yeah.
And so if it drops down, and then you might experience some pauses in your breathing, and that's what we call central sleep apnea.
Right. Well, dear listener, you are listening to Life Learnings, and my special guest in the studio is Lea-Anne Smith, who is a person that has a fascinating occupation. She is a health practitioner, but in breathing, and also orofacial myologist. Now, if people want to get in touch with you, just before we go to the break, where can they get your details? Do you have a website?
Yes, I do have a website, and it's simply this: Breathe Vitality, BREATHE. Vitality, Vitality.
All one word?
All one word, breathevitality.com.au.
Okay.
And you can contact me. My details are also on my website.
Okay, fantastic. Well, dear listener, we're just going to take a short break here, and we'll be right back after this message. Stay tuned.
God told Gideon that Gideon was going to lead Israel to a great victory over their bitter enemies. And Gideon wanted to be convinced he was about to do God's will. So he says to God in Judges 6 verse 37, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it's dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And then he did it again, but he asked God to let the fleece be dry and the ground be wet. And God twice granted the sign Gideon asked for. It's a good lesson for us. Before doing something bold for God, we should know that what we're about to do is actually His will. And when we ask God sincerely, one way or another, He will let us know. He told Gideon, and you can be sure that in the same way, He'll tell you. I'm John Bradshaw for It Is Written. Let's live today by every word.
Dear listener, welcome back to the program. I'm glad you've joined us here on Life Learnings. This is part 2, and I'm talking to a fascinating guest in my studio. Her name is Lea-Anne Smith, and she is a breathing practitioner and an orofacial myologist. Now, just before the break, we were talking about some fascinating aspects of breathing and how sometimes you think, well, I'm not breathing well enough, I need to breathe more. You could actually be hurting yourself rather than helping yourself. And it has to do with the CO2 levels. Now, I'm just speaking as a layman here, but that CO2 levels can have a lot of negative effects on the body. So there's some things that I thought I knew about breathing that I've just, it's just been put on its head, and I think, okay, well, the opposite is actually true. So, Lea-Anne, maybe just as a recap of what we've spoken about before, please.
Yeah, look, and you know, this is a common reaction that I get from people, because there is the thought out there that we need to breathe more. And if we're stressed, we particularly need to breathe more.
That's right.
And what happens is that this can upset the balance of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the body. And when we lower the amount of carbon dioxide in our body because we're breathing too much, it has a cascade of effects in the body. And we talked about how carbon dioxide is important to relax smooth muscle. So if the levels are low, then we get constriction of our airways. We get constriction of our arteries. Our GIT system, our gastrointestinal tract, might constrict a bit, giving us a reflux. We might need to empty our bladder more at night. So these are some of the things that happens when carbon dioxide is low. And one of the things that it does is, this is one that people really struggle to get their head around, but carbon dioxide in the bloodstream actually helps improve oxygen transfer into the brain and the body cells. And so breathing too much can actually lower the amount of oxygen that transfers into the brain and the muscles and the organs of the body. Now, that's quite a leap. But so you think, I need more oxygen to the brain. I'm going to start breathing really deeply, and then you could have a negative effect, the opposite. Absolutely, and this is what happens in a panic attack, which we'll talk about in a minute. We'll talk about that in a minute.
This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So back in 1903, 1906, somewhere in there was a doctor by the name of Christian Bohr, and he discovered this principle that certain things improve the transfer of oxygen or inhibit the transfer of oxygen off the hemoglobin. Now, for all those medical people out of there, this will cause you a little nightmare. You'll remember the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve from your lectures at university, I'm sure. But, doctors who work in intensive care and in accident and emergency and in theatre understand this very well. So, and basically this is what it says. So, oxygen bonds onto the hemoglobin in your bloodstream. And the hemoglobin carries it around the body.
Right.
And I liken this to, if you're going to move house, a truck might pull up at your house and you take all the furniture out and you put it in the truck and the truck drives down to the new location where you're going to live. Well, that truck is like the hemoglobin. It carries the oxygen.
Right.
You don't take the furniture down there one piece at a time to your new house. You put it all in the truck because it's more efficient. And the hemoglobin carries oxygen very efficiently in the human body. But when you get to the new house, how does the furniture get out of the truck into the new house? Do you just open the doors and it all falls out?
Well, hopefully
and walks itself in? No, you've got to be intentional about getting that furniture into the new house. And it's the same with oxygen that's been bonded to the hemoglobin. It has to be released. Now, how does the body know to release the oxygen off the hemoglobin so that it can transfer into the brain tissue or into the muscles or the organs of the body? It knows to let go of the oxygen if there's enough carbon dioxide in the system. So if there's not enough carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, then the hemoglobin says, well, you don't need any more oxygen, I'm just going to hang on to it. And so the hemoglobin keeps that tight bond to the oxygen and it doesn't transfer to the cell. So you've probably seen someone who's had I'm sure our listeners have seen someone who's had a panic attack at some stage of their life.
Yes.
And if you look at that person, are they breathing too little or they're breathing too much?
Their breathing is intensified and they're breathing deeper to try and help them relax.
Yeah. So they might be breathing probably anywhere up to 10 times as much as they need to.
Really?
So what we call a normal minute volume. A minute volume is how much air you breathe in 1 minute. So if you're breathing at 10 breaths a minute and you have a half a litre of air each time you breathe, that gives us a minute volume of about 5 litres a minute. Okay. So a normal minute volume is 4 to 6 litres a minute. Someone in a panic attack might be breathing up to 40 litres a minute.
Really?
So they are breathing like a little steam train. They're just absolutely breathing. But all the symptoms they're experiencing are actually symptoms of low oxygen. So they might feel really foggy in the head. They feel like fainting. They can't think. You might have trouble communicating with them because their brain is simply just not working.
Wow.
They have tingling around their mouth. They might have tingling in their fingers and their toes. And all of these are signs of low oxygen, oxygen not being transferred into the cell. Now, there's certainly plenty of oxygen bonded to their hemoglobin. There's plenty of oxygen in their blood supply.
Yeah.
But it's simply not breaking free of the hemoglobin so it can make its way into the tissues of the body. And so what's the normal treatment for a panic attack? Well,
Okay, I've seen this where they say take a plastic bag or a
paper bag
and then just put it around your mouth and your nose and just breathe in and out of that for a while.
Yeah, and so this is why this works, so the paper bag. So but basically what happens is they start to rebreathe their own carbon dioxide. Now remember we talked a minute ago about how low carbon dioxide makes a person feel anxious.
Yes.
It can cause, in the chronic ways, ADHD in children. So basically breathing into that paper bag, they start rebreathing their own carbon dioxide, and this pushes the level up in their bloodstream again so that the oxygen can transfer. And they start to feel calmer. And the other thing that the breathing into a paper bag does, it slows the breathing rate down as well. It provides a resistance to breathe against. And so this is why this particular technique works.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because I've seen it. I never knew why you had to do that. But I've just had to unlearn some things because I've once experienced a panic attack, and I remember just thinking, breathe, and I obviously was over-breathing and starving myself of oxygen where I was thinking I was filling myself with oxygen. But because of the way the body works, I was actually hindering the whole process rather than helping it.
That's often what happens, and other people around will be saying, breathe, breathe, breathe. But this poor person actually needs to breathe more quietly and more calmly, and hopefully through the nose because that helps slow the breathing down as well, rather than through the mouth. Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating stuff. Okay, so over-breathing is an issue. Where do we go next with this? Because I'm just learning so much as we're going through this.
Yeah, well, look, I have capnography equipment that actually...
What's it called, sorry?
Capnography equipment.
Capnography, okay.
Capnography equipment that actually tests the amount of carbon dioxide in the breath. And so when people come and say, look, I've got a breathing problem, and maybe they've got asthma, maybe they suffer with panic disorder, maybe they've got chronic allergies. Sometimes they just know that they're not breathing properly and they feel short of breath, but their doctors tell them there's nothing wrong.
Right.
That's not an uncommon picture as well. And so I hook them up to my capnography equipment, which actually just tests the amount of carbon dioxide in their breath. And from that we know whether they're over-breathing all the time, just chronically, or whether they just over-breathe in certain situations. And so we do some testing around that. Okay.
So we're talking about breathing. Now, I know that, the 8 laws of health, which is promoted by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, one of those is air. Now, air, obviously, if you don't breathe, air means nothing to you. So breathing would be an important part of that. So maybe can you just tell us the background to that and why that's always been presented as important? Because typically you think, okay, well, air is important, so therefore I've got to make sure I get a lot of it in. So we may have a tendency to want to over-breathe in because of that.
Yeah, look, when I got interested in breathing retraining, this was one thing that I really had to research through because I am very much a proponent of the 8 laws of health. And air, good pure air, is one of these. And, of course, the implication around that is that you breathe more.
Yeah.
And so I thought, how does this fit with what some of our church pioneers, who particularly instilled in our church the idea that perhaps we needed to breathe more. How does this actually fit? And so I went back and looked at what a lot of the pioneers in our church actually said about breathing. And we had a very prominent doctor, John Harvey Kellogg.
Oh, yes. He was well ahead of his time.
Was well ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And basically we have the cereals now, the Kellogg cereals that he left as a legacy. But so what did he say about breathing? And I was interested in this. And back then they called it carbonic acid. They didn't talk about carbon dioxide.
Ah, okay.
They talked about carbonic acid because it was the carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, in the plasma of the blood that was what they were talking about. And Kellogg basically called it a noxious poison. So I thought, okay, that's interesting.
Okay.
And then there were some other pioneers of the Adventist Church, and I looked at what they said, and we have J.N. Loughborough, who also said it was a noxious poison, and E.J. Wagner, who said it was a noxious poison, and James White himself, Ellen White's husband, called it a noxious poison, and Uriah Smith called it a noxious poison.
Okay, well, prominent, well-known pioneers of the Adventist Church.
Exactly. But I was most interested in what Ellen White might say about breathing.
Yeah.
because she was a leading pioneer of our church, and we believe that God, communicated with her.
Sure.
So she talks about breathing in much the same language as some of these men, but you know what? She does not call carbon dioxide a noxious poison. She does not mention it at all. She talks about the virtues of healthy breathing in very similar language to these men, and she talks about the wonders of oxygen, but never once mentions carbon dioxide or carbonic acid, as they talked about back then, which is really amazing considering that when you read the writings of these pioneers, they often copied each other. So either these men copied what she wrote and added their own thoughts, that carbon dioxide was a noxious poison,
yes,
or she copied what they wrote but left that out. So for me, this is evidence that Ellen White was truly a prophet, because what she said about breathing is absolutely right on the money with what science tells us today.
Okay, so there's some statements by Ellen White that addresses breathing and the importance of it in health?
Yes, she talks about what a good respiration means.
Okay.
And she talks about how it soothes the nervous system.
I have read that, yes.
Yeah. And now we know that it's maintaining a good, the normal amount of carbon dioxide in the system that soothes the system. And that if you overbreathe, you can become quite anxious. Some of the other things she says, she talks about deep breathing. Now, I tend not to talk about deep breathing because this can be a little bit confusing. Deep breathing can mean deep in the lung, down near the diaphragm, or it can mean a great humongous big breath.
Okay.
So I tend to avoid the term. But if you think about the context of the times in which Ellen White lived, the women wore very tight corsets around the waist.
Right.
And so they tended to chest breathe. In fact, a lot of people today tend to chest breathe. And when I look at their breathing, I can see their diaphragm's not moving at all.
Okay.
And so what happens is if you chest breathe, you're much more likely to overbreathe. And I think this is probably why when women wore very tight clothing around the middle that restricted the movement of the diaphragm, they were much more likely to faint.
Yes. I've seen some of these old movies and how often they'd faint and they have to sort of revive them again without a fright.
Yes.
Okay. So that's actually true. That's true.
Yeah, women don't faint like that today.
No, I haven't seen that for quite a while.
I've seen some groomsmen fall over at weddings.
Yes, well, that is true.
But I think this is related to the very tight corsets that women wore around their middle. And Ellen White says that, we should have unrestricted movement of the lungs during breathing. So she understood that this very tight clothing around the middle was not healthy. Yeah. I found that study very interesting, and it confirmed for me that science today has got it right.
Okay. Well, fascinating. Before you mention something about mouth breathing, can you perhaps just unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, mouth breathing. Yeah. Look, I don't think there's a dentist in this country that does not realise that today mouth breathing is the leading cause of crooked teeth. And
wow.
They look in a child's mouth and they see the damage that's caused by crooked teeth, but they don't necessarily know. See the damage caused by mouth breathing, but they don't necessarily know how to help the child move to nasal breathing. Okay. And so it's just easier to rely on orthodontics when a child is older to get the teeth sorted out. But how does this work? Well, if you take your one hand, so if our listeners take one hand, spread your fingers out a little bit and curl them. Right. And pretend that that's your upper jaw, okay? And your little fingers are your teeth, okay? So they're the teeth in your upper jaw. And then you take your other hand and you fit your other hand up in the first hand, and you pretend that is the tongue, okay?
Right, okay.
Now, what the tongue does is a very strong little muscle, and it exerts an outward pressure on the teeth, okay?
Right.
So if your tongue is not up in the top of your mouth, then you do not get the pressures in your mouth to push the growth of that top jaw outwards and forwards. And so the structures around the outer face, the skin and the muscles that lie over the top of your upper jaw exert greater pressures and the jaw does not push out and grow out. And so then there's not enough room for the teeth to come down. Now, every child has the potential to grow a face that fits its teeth.
Right, okay, that's fascinating. Because nowadays the problem is they have too many teeth. But the problem is not too many teeth. The problem is just that the jaw and the development
has not grown enough
to fit all the teeth.
Yes.
So that the teeth aren't the problem, the jaw's the problem.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So this is basically about altered craniofacial development. And in fact, if you look at pictures of yesterday's movie stars, if you look at people like Liz Taylor, Marilyn Monroe, you'll see these big, wide, beautiful faces. You look at the movie stars today and you'll see that they have much, much narrower faces than they did back in yesteryear.
Right.
And it's because of a change to lifestyle, change to what people eat, change to how people breathe.
So there's a number of factors, and breathing being one of those.
Breathing is one of those. So basically, if you're breathing through your mouth, then you have to drop the tongue down into a low position to open the airway.
Okay.
And so if the tongue is not up in the top of the mouth, if you've got to breathe through your mouth, the tongue is low. And so all those structures that we just talked about, the skin and the muscles on the outside of the mouth, create a stronger pressure. And so then the jaw doesn't grow outwards like it should.
Right.
And the other thing is that today our diets are not what they used to be. A few years, 50, 100 years ago, children were breastfed for much longer, which created much wider faces because breastfeeding has a different type of sucking action to a bottle. So children tend to be weaned from the breast earlier. Then they may have a bottle or a dummy, and they're weaned to very soft foods. So they might have pureed foods, mashed foods. As they grow up, they're more likely to be drinking yogurts, eating ice cream, biscuits that melt in the mouth, things that don't stimulate a lot of chewing. And it's the jaw's like any part of the body. You need to exercise it to grow it. If you've got osteoporosis and you go to the doctor and they say, let's do some lifestyle things here, they'll encourage you to go and exercise to help your osteoporosis. Well, the jaw, to stimulate growth, needs lots of exercise to stimulate the blood flow to the jaw. And we don't have mothers and grandmothers that tell us anymore, chew your food 20 times before you swallow it.
Right, yes.
And we don't eat a lot of raw food, those raw apples and carrots and cabbages and broccolis, and even lettuce requires a lot of chewing. And so because we're not chewing, we don't get the growth of that upper jaw. And this has really changed the way the human face is actually looking. And so the numbers of children with crooked teeth have gone to just around 5 to 10% to over 80% in one generation.
Is that right? That's a significant change, isn't it?
That is a massive change. That is a massive change. Yeah.
So the factors that can change these, these facial developments. So is mouth breathing? Would that be?
Absolutely. So children today are more likely to develop allergies that block their nose, and then they end up switching to mouth breathing, which causes overbreathing and some of the problems we've talked about. But it also means that if they're mouth breathing, then the upper jaw is not going to grow as it should, and then they'll end up with crooked teeth.
Wow. Okay. And then the second one, as far as those factors that influence, you've got the mouth breathing being, what, number one?
Yes. Yeah, the dietary factors.
Dietary factors.
And no longer breastfeeding children as long as we used to.
Breastfeeding, so that's number three, basically. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So the long-term consequences of these changes, I mean...
Yeah, it's really sad because a child who doesn't grow their jaw outward as far as they need to, they might end up with orthodontics, or have some teeth removed, which means that the jaw will never really achieve its potential growth. That means that the child's airways are going to be smaller because the size of the child's airways is related to the size of the jaws and the mouth. And in fact, If you look at the face, basically the top of the mouth is the floor of the nose. And so the nose will be thinner. The internal part of the nose will not be as wide. They're more likely to get blocked nose and keep this problem going. And so if you've got smaller airways, that means you're more likely to develop some sort of sleep breathing disorder later in life. And so the rise of snoring and sleep apnea that we're seeing is related to the smaller airways that we now have as a result of these changes in the last generation.
Well, that's incredible, because we spoke about the importance of, obviously, the things that keep you alive. Now, you can maybe go without food for a month or so. You can go without water for 7 days or so, I guess, depending on, temperatures and that. But breathing, it's a matter of minutes, and you've lost it. So if those airways are smaller and the air that you're bringing into your lungs, you're breathing more shallow, breathing more frequently instead of breathing relaxed and slowly, all those factors are going to have a very negative impact on your health.
They do. And so what happens is, for children who do end up with smaller airways, and they struggle to breathe at night, and you'll often notice a child that's struggling to breathe, they'll have their head tipped back to try to open up their airway.
Okay.
And their body is pumping adrenaline all night because their airway is under threat. We're seeing more and more kids with snoring and sleep apnea, which is really sad. And snoring impacts the development of a child's brain. They struggle more in the classroom, they'll struggle more in the playground with relationships, they'll struggle more with their fine motor skills, a whole range of things. They're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, 1.5 to 2 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD if they're snoring. And small airways can help bring all of this about. So these are things that basically, I think one of the most important things a parent can do to set a child up for good health through life is to make sure that they're breathing through their nose.
Okay.
And that their tongue is resting in the right position in the mouth, which is what the oral facial myology is all about.
Right, okay. So we've only got a few minutes left, but, are there any suggestions, take-home suggestions, that kids or parents can make sure that their kids can take on to help them with all these?
Yeah, sure. So as we just mentioned, number one thing, if your child is not breathing through their nose, you need to find out why.
Okay.
And perhaps their nose is blocked, perhaps they've developed a habit that needs correcting. And even if they are, to make sure that the tongue is in the top of the mouth. And that's what we do as oral facial myologists, is we work with getting the tongue up into the top of the mouth. This is what God designed for how the body works, to breathe through the nose, because it filters out the bacteria and the allergens and keeps a person healthy. Feed your children crunchy foods.
Okay.
They need to be exercising their jaw muscle along with everything else. These days, sometimes I think children just inhale their food. Really soft stuff,
Yes.
Soft white bread, mashed potato, other things that just crunch down really, really quickly and easily. But get your children eating raw food so that they're exercising their mouths, and remind them to chew their food properly before they swallow it, because this is all exercise for the upper jaw. Encourage a child to play outdoors rather than use electronic devices indoors. We haven't talked about the impact of electronic devices on airways today, but that's another discussion that we could have.
Oh, wow.
But suffice to say that the best strategy for your children in terms of healthy development is outdoor play. If your child is snoring, absolutely get help. It is not normal to snore, and it adversely affects the growing brain in children. There is suggestions now in the research that snoring causes low levels of permanent brain damage. And so it needs to be addressed. If you've got a child that's snoring, this is something you've got to address. And if your child is developing crooked teeth, get onto it early.
The earlier the better, I'd imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oral facial myology can actually turn around the development of the jaw and the development of the teeth. So basically, I could, if we had a visual medium here, I could show you pictures of children who've had breathing retraining and what has happened to their teeth as a result of breathing retraining. You can save big money on orthodontist bills by getting onto your child's habits, facial habits, early in life.
Right, okay.
Plus proof them against snoring and sleep apnea later in life as well.
Yeah, I've been fascinated just by, talking to friends and then people saying, I didn't sleep well because my kid was snoring. I go, well, kids don't snore. It's old people that snore, but more and more I'm hearing of kids that are actually snoring. And
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah, that is fascinating. So just in closing, can we just share your contact details again in case people want to get in touch with you? Because, this has been fascinating stuff. And I personally would like to know a little bit more. I'm just thinking there's a few bad habits that I picked up. I think I was helping myself, but I was perhaps hindering myself. So knowledge is important.
Yeah, look, the best way to get in contact with me is through my website, and that is Breathe Vitality, BREATHE, Vitality, VITALITY.com.au. All one word, breathevitality.com.au.
Okay, fantastic. And you operate from Toowoomba? That's where you practice?
I operate from Toowoomba, but I also consult with people over Skype. There's not a lot of breathing retrainers and oral-facial myologists around, but most of us work by Skype as well. Okay,
fantastic. Well, I want to thank my special guest in the studio, Lea-Anne Smith, for sharing her expertise. And dear listener, I've just been fascinated by what I've had to hear. And I know no doubt you would have been as well. It's interesting how some of the things I thought I was doing to help myself, especially if you're feeling a little bit panicky, a little bit stressful, may actually have been hindering myself rather than helping myself. But if you haven't got those contact details written down, you're welcome to contact us here at 3ABN Australia. You can ring us on 0249 73 3456, or you're welcome to email us at radio@3abnaustralia.org.au. Or you can even contact us on our 3ABN Australia Radio Facebook page. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us again today here on Life Learnings. We look forward to catching up with you next time. Until then, God bless.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.